All right, so this is the Shiki FF08. It's a specialty mini ITX case, and it's basically the definition of a compact, high-end, built with intention small form factor case. It's about 6.3 liters in volume, machined from this super thick aluminum, and it costs around $400. And that's without the extras like a power supply unit and a very interesting motherboard that I want to talk about later on. So let's get this out of the way. Yes, it's very expensive, but like all of Shiki's cases, it's one of the most unique and beautifully built SFF cases that I've ever handled. Now, first off, the build quality is just ridiculous. This thing feels like a solid block of aluminum. There's no flex, no weird gaps or anything like that. It is very heavy for its small size, and I do mean that in a good way. However, I don't think that this is something you're gonna wanna like throw in your backpack and take with you very often. I would probably still look at a Vel case for that, but this one definitely feels far more premium than any of the other cases that I've used at this size category. Now, visually, it is really minimal. It's just a small, clean, rectangular box, and you can get it in black or silver. So it's got some retro vibes for sure, but it definitely stands out without, trying too hard. These squared off corners are very sharp, so you're definitely gonna wanna look out for those, but the edges are smooth, and luckily fingerprints, they don't show nearly as much as I would expect from a black aluminum case. Now, building in this thing is actually very straightforward. The panels use this clever toolless mechanism. You push them forward and then they unlatch. From there, they can swing open on a hinge. It's very satisfying to watch that front panel. It moves from one side to the other to make room for that hinge. Now, there is a catch here with that. You can only have one side fully open at a time. And that's just because of how the hinge works. It gets in the way of the front panel. So I didn't really run into any issues when I was installing the motherboard or the GPU or anything like that. But cable management does require a little bit of back and forth. So you want to keep that in mind. Internally, it's pretty constrained as you would expect from a case this size. You get support for mini ITX motherboards only, 37 millimeters of CPU cooler clearance, and Flex ATX power supply unit compatibility. Shiki actually has its own 600 watt unit, and so you can order that with the case and it'll come pre-installed. You can also order some motherboards that would come pre-installed as well. And if you go that route, you could basically just drop in your CPU, your cooler, your RAM, your SSD, and then the GPU on the other side, and you're done. So if you went that route, you could probably be up and running with this thing in like under an hour. But let's talk about that motherboard though, because it's actually super interesting. So Shiki actually designed this case to work natively with these motherboards. This is from Maxon. This is called the B760 BKB or something like that, which it's an ITX board with two PCI Express slots. The main one, the 5.0 X16 slot that you're gonna use for your GPU, is actually integrated on the back, which means you don't need any risers. You just plug your GPU directly into the board still for a sandwich style case. I think this is really cool and something that I would love to see other manufacturers do. Not needing to pick up a PCI Express riser cable would make building a little bit easier, less expensive, because you obviously wouldn't need to worry about buying a riser cable on top of everything else. And cases that do include them could offer a version without it, and that should bring the price of the case down. It also gives you a secondary PCI Express slot on the front. And I don't think I've seen any cases that could take advantage of, both a front and rear PCI Express slot like that, at least like not a small form factor one. But I could imagine if this style of ITX board becomes more mainstream, you could probably see more cases like that. You could imagine a situation where you might want like a capture card on the front and then of course your GPU on the back. But, something to consider is I don't think this would be an outright replacement for your traditional ITX boards. It's not going to be perfect in every situation, even in all sandwich style cases. So as an example, if you were to want to build with a founder's card in the back, you'd probably want to get your standard motherboard with riser cable. That way you can use some standoffs to create a little bit more room, some more distance between the back of the motherboard and the GPU. That way you have more room for the exhaust fans. Anyways, you definitely don't have to buy one of these boards with this case. I did two builds actually in this case, one with this Maxon board, and then I wanted to see what it'd be like with a standard board as well with a riser cable. So I used a 19 centimeter dual reverse cable, and then I plugged that into an Asus B760i board. And from there, I used the same Intel 13400 CPU, the same Noctua L9i cooler, and then the same 32 gigs of RAM. And yeah, that experience was just as straightforward as I'd hoped as well. You don't need to take the whole case apart like you do some of the other cases in this size category, at least if you get it with the power supply unit pre-installed. which again, I would recommend doing that just for the flexible custom cables alone. Then from there, there's enough space along the side and the lower compartment to tuck away any unused power connectors. Now, the power supply unit that you can get with this comes with 3 SATA power leads. Since it's modular, you can remove those, but honestly, if you plan to add more drives later, it's super convenient to just kind of leave them in and tuck them away. Because for storage, you can fit up to 3 2.5-inch SSDs. If you're using a low profile card, there's room directly above it for 2 drives. Then there's this tray at the top that you can slide out and put an additional SSD in. That one's already set up with a bridge adapter so that the drive and its tray don't rattle around once you slide it back in and connect it. It's a really clever design, and it's a surprising amount of SSD support for such a small case. For ventilation, there are these openings on the back half of the case that wrap all the way around. They're cleanly cut and positioned right over the CPU and the GPU, but there's no mesh. So if dust is a problem for you, then this might not be it. There are also no mounting points for any additional case fans or anything like that. The aluminum chassis kind of just soaks in all the heat, and you can really feel that when it's under load. The whole thing gets pretty hot. Now, if you're using efficient components like my i5 13400 and a compact RTX 5060, it's totally manageable. My CPU has a TDP of 65 watts, and I'm using a Noctua L9i cooler. So no thermal throttling when keeping it at stock settings. Those stock settings are going to limit the CPU to that 65 watts. And that low profile cooler is able to keep the temps under control, averaging around 71 degrees. I would generally recommend sticking with a 65 watt CPU when using a cooler that small, unless you're planning to undervolt or set power limits manually. Now, for example, if you were to remove that 65 watt cap, Cinebench immediately pushes the CPU into thermal throttling. We're talking 100 degrees Celsius within minutes. That is a worst case scenario for sure, but it's still a useful stress test. It's also a bit louder as you would expect. The fan ramps up from 1600 RPM to 2300 RPM in that scenario, and that's far more noticeable. At idle, the PC is completely silent. In game, I was measuring around 47 to 48 decibels. You can definitely hear that if you're listening for it, but I wouldn't consider it distractingly loud. But when the fans were running at 2300 RPM during the Cinebench test, that was definitely noticeable. Now, in more real world scenarios like gaming in Cyberpunk 2077 with the CPU unlocked, it only pulled a few extra watts above TDP and it still kept temps in check. But in a more CPU heavy game, I could definitely see a situation where you could run into some thermal throttling. Now, same story for my GPU. My Zotac Solo RTX 5060, that averaged around 80 degrees Celsius, and it was pulling its 145 watts. That's on the warmer side, but still well within spec for a compact single fan card like this, especially in a case with no active airflow. But this is a very aesthetics and style first case. And in this case, that means you are giving up some airflow and performance for looks and the form factor. So unlike Shiki's older cases, those were all designed around one specific GPU. This one is far more flexible than that. As long as it's a short GPU that's under 200 millimeters, it'll fit. That gives this case like actual true upgrade potential. Maybe not a ton, but it is enough that I could absolutely see myself upgrading this over the years. So yeah, this is a very niche case. It's expensive, its airflow is limited, and it does require some, careful part selection. But at the same time, this is like made for people like me. It's something it's premium, it's tiny, it's absolutely gorgeous on your desk. I just think it nails the aesthetic. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.